Hare Krishna. Welcome to another evening in the lives of the Vaishnavacharyas. My name is Chaturatma. First off, I'd like to apologize for our late start. Due to the kind donations that our viewers, those of you listening and those of you that are in our chat room, have sent in to Krishna.com, we've been able to upgrade our equipment. But that new equipment is not without its kinks that we're still working out. So our apologies for the late start, but we're here. I'm glad to see that all the usual cast and crew are there in the chat room. Nice to have you all with us, and we'll give it another run this evening. One thing I wanted to cover a bit before we start is the process of devotional service as we know it, given by the Acharyas, consists of 9 activities, and the 2 most important of those activities are Shravanam and Kirtanam, hearing and chanting, or chanting and hearing, whichever way you'd like to look at it. Shravanam, Kirtanam. Now, everyone in this world engages in the process of Shravanam, Kirtanam. Unfortunately, those who are not settled in the process of devotional service engage in Shravanam Kirtanam as described in the Bhagavad Gita, that is dukalayam ashashvatam, temporary, and brings about an unpleasant, unhappy result. The actual word is miserable, but a little harsh for this explanation. So the process of devotional service recommends that we engage in Shravanam Kirtanam Vishnu, so that we hear and chant about the Lord. Now, when one hears and chants about the Lord, that automatically includes hearing and chanting about the devotees of the Lord. This is a very important point, which I've discussed many, many times, because it's something I personally have had a little bit of realization, but particularly feel is a very strong point in our devotional process. And that is to discuss and talk about the pastimes of our great acharyas. Not only, as I've mentioned, does this give us an understanding of our own heritage, and not only does this give us an appreciation of where our teachings are coming from, but it's a necessity. And at this point, I'd like to read a quote from Baladev Vijayabhushana. Of course, Baladev Vijayabhushana, our Sampradaya, owes a great debt to him, and one of these evenings we will discuss his activities. He has written an item, it's a set of prayers called the Prameya Ratnavali. And in the Prameya Ratnavali, in the first group, he says that the learned disciple should daily remember the entire flawless disciplic succession. From such remembrance comes single-minded devotion, and from such devotion the pleasure of Lord Hari. So he's encouraging that we should remember the acharyas that have come before us. Now, Srila Prabhupada takes this even further, and I quote from Prabhupada here: the disciple purifies his own character by hearing and discussing the exemplary lives of the previous spiritual masters. As the disciple's character is purified, he identifies himself as a servant of the pure devotees. He thus receives the blessings of the Lord to engage in bhajan without distractions. Narottam Das Thakur says that Nityananda's lotus feet are eternal, and the servant of Lord Nityananda is also thus eternal. When the living being abandons his materialistic way of thinking and takes shelter of the transcendental lotus feet of the spiritual master, he attains the eternal spiritual world and his greatest good. Now, there's a couple of very interesting points that Srila Prabhupada makes here. First of all, what does it mean to be a disciple? It means that one wants to purify themselves, to rid themselves of the anarthas that restrict the heart from manifesting pure bhakti. So Prabhupada mentions that the way one does that is by hearing and chanting, hearing and discussing the activities of the lives of the previous spiritual masters, the previous acharyas, the lives of the Vaishnava acharyas. Thus we call this evening session on Mondays. Then he mentions that as the character of that disciple becomes purified, he identifies himself as a servant of these personalities. This is very important because our life is just totally bound up with identifying who we are. I'm the servant of my wife. I am the servant of my boss. I am the servant of my children. I am the servant of my parents. I am the servant of my school. I am the servant of my tongue. I am the servant of my genital, and so on and so on and so on and so on. These are all the different temporary identities we give ourselves. But here Prabhupada says when we engage in hearing and chanting, discussing the activities of the lives of the previous acharyas, we begin to identify ourselves as their servants. This is the goal, to realize that my real purpose in life is to serve the pure devotees. Thus, what happens when that takes place, Prabhupada says, is that the Lord allows us His blessings. He gives us His blessings so that we can engage in bhajan. And what does bhajan mean? Bhajan means to continue to hear and chant. The ends and the means. So the Lord blesses us to engage in bhajan without distraction. So many distractions are there in our mind. I know, I believe it's Wednesday night, Mahatma Prabhu discusses the importance of chanting. Tuesday nights. It discusses the importance of chanting and how to chant without distractions. Here's one of those ways. By taking that time when we're not chanting our japa and engaging that time in hearing and chanting about the pastimes of the great devotees. By doing that, then we get the blessings of the Lord to perform the rest of our service without distraction. Very important point. So I wanted to just share that. I came across that. It's a very, very wonderful explanation of how important it is to hear and chant about these great devotees. And tonight we're going to speak about two devotees that have a very similar name that causes some confusion, as we'll hear later. I'm sure in whatever temple you're listening to, you have that, two Govindas. He's talking about, well, I talked to Govinda, and he said, well, which Govinda? Well, such and such Govinda. So we have had this wonderful dilemma of multiply named devotees since the time of Mahaprabhu. And these two devotees tonight, Narahari Chakravarti Thakur and Narahari Sarakara Thakur. These two devotees have very, very similar names. And we'll discuss a little more about the confusion and mixing up like that. But first we're going to talk about the life of Narahari Chakravarti Thakur. Narahari Chakravarti Thakur would be what you might describe the third generation of Mahaprabhu's associates. The first being the immediate associates, Rup, Sanatan, Govinda, Gadadhar, the Panchatattva, like that. The second wave being Narottam, Srinivas, Shamananda, devotees of that genre. And the third wave being devotees that came a bit further down. Narahari Chakravarti Thakur would be one of those. So Narahari Chakravarti Thakur took his birth in the 1600s, late 15-something, I believe 1570, something like that. And in West Bengal, in a village called Rainapur. And in the village of Rainapur, his father was by the name of Jagannath Vipra. At birth, Narahari Chakravarti's name was Ganesham Das. Very, very wonderful name. We knew one devotee in our society, Ganesham Prabhu, and eventually became Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj. So, now his father, Jagannath Vipra, was a very, very senior and prominent disciple of Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. So we see the line is going there. Narahari himself was a disciple of Nrsimha Chakravarti. Nrsimha Chakravarti is in the disciplic succession coming from Srinivasacharya. So we see the connection is very tight there with his association with Mahaprabhu's pastimes. In his youth, it's mentioned that he very strictly observed a vow of celibacy, all through his life, but particularly in his youth. And this is, especially in our society nowadays, for someone to be a young man and follow celibacy is considered a great austerity indeed. It mentions that because of this, all of his activities were very saintly and very pure. We know that when one's consciousness is diverted away from the carnal desires and one practices these vows of celibacy, the qualities of saintliness and purity manifest within one's consciousness. It's very, very wonderful. As a result of these qualities, he was always a very meek and humble devotee. Always of the state of mind of thinking, no, myself, I'm actually a very mischievous rascal. And this is the state of mind we find in most of the advanced devotees, that they had a very wonderful quality of humility, and as a result of that, always thought of themselves very unfortunately, you know. There's a devotee in our modern day ISKCON, and he does these wonderful seminars. Peter Burwash is his name. He's in a lot of Prabhupada's association. And he was speaking about the 25 qualities of a leader within our society. And one of these qualities he mentioned is humble. And he gave a little paraphrase. He said, let me see if I can get this right. He said, to be humble doesn't mean to think less of yourself, but to think of not to think of yourself, but to think of yourself less, right. Not to think less of yourself like you're just have nothing worth offering, but to spend less time thinking of yourself. That's what it was. Yeah. So this is the type of consciousness we see in Narahari Chakravarti Thakur. And because of this, he would say in his service, he would say, no, I am unfit to serve the Lord. I have no qualifications at all for the service you're asking. And this wasn't, as we might find by some crafty persons who are actually lazy, a ploy to not do service. As we'll see, he did many, many, many types of service. But he didn't want to engage in any intimate service with the deity. Now, it mentions that he was very, very learned in all the musical arts. Music itself, composing music, in singing, in dancing, and playing different musical instruments. He was expert in these fields. And he knew the integral science of how to use these different art forms of music, dance, and singing for the satisfaction of the Lord, for praising Lord Krishna and for praising the associates of the Lord. It mentions that he was also very well versed in all the Bhakti Shastras. And as a result of being well versed in all the Bhakti Shastras, he knew how to properly perform various types of devotional service. This is what one gets when they become knowledgeable in the field of devotional service, the understanding of how to properly execute devotional service. Sometimes we see that someone may be very enthusiastic to do something but doesn't have any training, and as a result they just make a mess of things. Prabhupada describes different types of intelligence: active intelligence and lazy intelligence. And then there's active foolishness and lazy foolishness. So someone may be very, very active, but if they're not intelligent, it will simply cause some difficulty. Prabhupada gives the example of the monkey. Monkey's very, very active. As you all know, I just spent some time in Vrindavan, and the monkeys there are very, very active. And if they've got nothing else to do, they'll jump up on a tree and just shake the tree or a pole, just for the sake of creating a disturbance, just to do something like that. So, very, very active, but very foolish. So we want to be intelligent. So he was very intelligent, knowing the Bhakti Shastras and how to perform the different types of devotional service. And he was personally chosen by the Lord to be in the Vrindavan, in the Radha Govinda temple. He was personally chosen by the Lord to be a cook. He was an expert cook. And it mentions that he was not only an expert cook, but he was an expert priest as well. So pujari and cook. And most really, really good pujaris, you'll see they're usually really, really good cooks too, with the exception of my really, really bad self. I can't cook anything more than khichdi. So, but he had mastered the art of making all types of palatable dishes for the satisfaction of the Lord. And whenever he traveled, he would always establish what were the real devotional principles that the Vaishnavas should be following. And as a result, Vaishnavas respected him very, very much. They had a great appreciation for his qualities. So, fulfilling the desire of his father, Jagannath Vipra, and fulfilling the desire of the Lord himself, he spent the majority of his time engaged in the personal service of Radha Govinda. And it mentions that some of the activities he performed was the grinding of sandalwood paste and the collecting of firewood for the cooking for the Lord, cleansing of the temple courtyard, picking tulsi leaves and tulsi manjaris. And then many of you that may have been to India, you see how from outside the altar they have a rope that goes through and then is connected to a fan above the deities, and you stand there and pull this rope, and it fans the deities like that. And so he would do this. This is an opportunity for those that are not qualified to be on the altar to render some service for the pleasure of the Lord, this fanning like this. You see this in many of the temples. Most prominently, I've seen it in the Bunki Bihari temple in Vrindavan. So these activities, generally we think, oh, I'm an advanced devotee now, I don't have to sweep and mop the temple room. You know, oh, I'm an advanced devotee now, someone else will, well, in this case, collect the firewood, but wash the pots might be a comparable, you know, explanation. But he was very, very satisfied to render these things. And because of this, out of his own humility, he kept himself at a distance from the deities and from their intimate pujaris. But, as I mentioned, he wasn't lazy. It mentions that he did the service of 10 men. And all the temple pujaris, they would say, you know, it's not proper you do this type of low service. You should come and do something more personal like this. And he would say, no, 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 no. He said, I am a very fallen devotee. I have no right to come before the Lord in this manner. So, you know, you please just, you know, let me stay there. I'll just continue with what I'm doing. The Lord is very, very merciful that He's let me render whatever service I am doing. So I'm satisfied in that way. So in this way, Narahari Chakravarti passed his days deeply absorbed in devotional service to Sri Radha Govindaji. And he was always very respectful to any Vaishnava that came. You know, sometimes you read on some of these devotee websites people complaining about the way they were treated when they came to this temple or that temple. But Narahari Chakravarti respected everyone that came to the temple very, very nicely. And as a result of this, it mentions that all the Vaishnavas always spoke amongst themselves about the wonderful, good qualities of Narahari Chakravarti. They always respected him in this way. So, you know, he cooked for the deities well into his 70s. And the interesting thing, it reminded me of this story of, there was one devotee in Vrindavan. His name was Vibhu Chaitanya. And Vibhu Chaitanya was an old Bengali when I was living in Vrindavan doing deity service in the late 70s. And it was a very short time I was there, but during that time I remember he was there and he was the cook. And he was cooking all day long for Krishna and Balaram. And then he became so elderly and his eyesight went bad and he wasn't able to cook anymore. So he sat outside the front of Radhasham Sundar's altar there and he passed out Charnamrita to devotees. And eventually, I believe, he left his body in this manner. So very, very wonderful devotee like that. So well into his 70s, it mentions Narahari Chakravarti cooked for the Lord. And simultaneous with his cooking and doing all this menial service, he wrote many, many books. And he wrote books about not only the Goswamis themselves of Vrindavan, but all the other different Gaudiya Acharyas. So the lives of the great devotees, it mentions, you know, we have the Chaitanya Bhagavat, and we have the Chaitanya Charitamrita, and the Chaitanya Mangala, and these just explain Lord Chaitanya and his immediate associates. But after that, we don't have very much information about them. It's difficult even for some of the associates of Mahaprabhu's time who requested they not be mentioned, such as Lokanath and Gopal Bhatta. It's hard to find any information out about them. And then you have Prabhupada, who was Gopal Bhatta's elder brother, and Srinivas, Narottam, Shamananda, of course. So Narahari Chakravarti took it upon himself, with the encouragement of his spiritual master and with the encouragement of the Vaishnavas, to research and put together the history of these acharyas. So in his famous book on this information, the Bhakti Ratnakar, which I've quoted from many times, it's a wonderful, wonderful book, which now you can get through Krishna.com. Previously it was not available hardly at all in the West. So through that book we have very, very detailed descriptions about the lives of these devotees. And in addition, we find in his book Narottam Vilas that he's written very widely about the pastimes of Narottam Das Thakur. Now, in the 5th chapter of his Bhakti Ratnakar, he gives a very, very detailed description of the entire Braj Mandala area. And then in the 12th chapter of Bhakti Ratnakar, he gives a very detailed description of the Navadvip Mandala. So it's almost like, you know, you've got a fully illustrated map from these 2 chapters of Bhakti Ratnakar on the pastime places in Braj and in Gaura Mandala. And these are very, very wonderful for devotees to read as the different disciples and grand disciples and all are going around to these places taken by these senior devotees. And Narahari Chakravarti is giving all the full explanations of this. So it's very, very, very wonderful. And just a few of the important books that he's written. I mentioned the Narottam Vilas, which of course is the pastimes of Narottam Das Thakur and his associates. And then he wrote a book called the Nam Amrita Samudra. And the Nam Amrita Samudra is a glorification of the various names of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Another one of his famous books was the Srinivas Charita, which of course is the pastimes of Srinivasacharya and his associates. And then there's the Sangita Sara Sangraha. The Sangita Sara Sangraha is a wonderful, wonderful book about the proper devotional use of music and poetry and dance, how all of this works together for the presentation of devotional principles. And then, of course, we mentioned the Bhakti Ratnakara, which is the second, third wave generation of devotees of Mahaprabhu. And then finally, one of his other famous books is the Gora Charita Samudra. And this is an additional book about further pastimes of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So these are some of the writings of Narahari Chakravarti Thakur. And those of you that have a great desire to be good cooks for your Thakurji in your home or your presiding deity in your temple, Radhakala Chanji or Kishore Kishori or whatever the deity you're serving is, then he's a very wonderful personality to remember. Unfortunately, as it mentions at the end of most of his biographies, there is little more information available about him. This was something that we lament many times in our broadcast, how there's not a lot more information available about these different individuals, but it makes that which we do have that much more relishable. So now we're going to move on to a devotee, Narahari Sarakara Thakur. Narahari Sarakara Thakur is kind of in between. He's not one of the immediate confidential associates of Mahaprabhu, but he comes before the Srinivas Narottam Shamananda generation. Of course, he is very involved, as we'll see, with Mahaprabhu's pastimes, but he's not like a member of the Panchatattva or so. He was born in Srikunda. Now, of course, many, many times we've spoken so wonderfully about this village of Srikunda. So I'm not going to speak about Srikunda. I'm going to read what Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami has to say about Srikunda, because who can give better for glorification than Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami? He describes that the residents of Srikunda form one of the major branches of the desire tree of love of God of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He says the Sri Kandavasis, the Kandavasi refers to, of course, someone living in Srikunda. The Sri Kandavasi, Mukunda and his son Raghunandana were the 39th branch of the tree of devotional service of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Narahari Sarakara was the 40th branch, Chiranjiva was the 41st branch, and Sulochan was the 42nd. They were all big major branches of the merciful tree of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. They distributed the fruits and flowers of love of Godhead anywhere and everywhere. This comes from the 10th chapter of the Adi Lila of the Chaitanya Charitamrita of Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami. He gives this very nice description. If any of you are interested, you can go to that 10th chapter, and there's a wonderful description of each of the branches of the tree of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Now, if you have a big tree growing in your yard, you can see there's so many branches, and just imagine a full description on each branch as if it were a personality. And that's what the 10th chapter of the Adi Lila gives us on these personalities of Mahaprabhu's pastimes. Furthermore, Jagannath Das Babaji Maharaj has stated the following. Navadvip is the abode of Gokula, of Goloka. Vrindavan is the abode of Gokula, and Srikunda is the abode of Vaikuntha. So very, very nice description there. So these devotees that lived in Srikunda are highly respected in all of the Gaura Lila literatures. So Srila Narahari Sarakara Thakur was born in Srikunda either in 1479 or 1480. His father's name was Sri Narayana Das, and his mother's name was Sri Goyi. And Narayana Das and Goyi had 3 sons. The eldest son was Mukunda, the middle son was Madhava, and the youngest son was Narahari. So these were the boys in that family, and this family was the pride of the Vaishnavas of Sri Kunda. They were very, very well respected, and everyone loved them so much. They were a Vaidya caste, the doctor, the physician caste, and very well respected. Now, after Narayana, the father, passed away, then the oldest brother, of course the eldest son, would take responsibility in this way. So Mukunda, being the eldest son, he sent Narahari to, where did he send him? To Navadvip, of course. He sent him to Navadvip for his education. And while in Navadvip, this was how Narahari got his access to the pastimes of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Because Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was still in his Navadvip Leela at that time. So it mentions that he very quickly learned all the different forms of learning, all the different rhetoric and shastra and, all these different things. But in addition, he also became very learned in music, singing, and poetry. So both of these Naraharis, we see they had a very musical background to them. So in addition, Narahari Sarakara became very expert in the, it mentions he became a connoisseur of the flavors of using devotion in these different types of learning. So not just a dry logician, not just somebody that had a lot of book knowledge, but he knew how to add the flavor of devotional service to that, Very, very wonderful like that. So as a result of this, even before he met Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu officially, he was already writing songs in glorification of the Braj Leela of Sri Radhika Giridhari. So he was in that mood, and of course associating with Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu enhanced that mood. Now he became very, very close with Gadadhar. Gadadhar Pandit Goswami was constantly, as we know, by the Lord's side. Mother Sachi saw that he could give some protection to Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. There's that wonderful pastime when Mahaprabhu learned that Radha and Krishna were within his heart, and he began clawing at his chest. And Gadadhar stopped him. So Sachimata requested, my dear Gadadhar, I see you can save my son and protect him from himself, so you please always stay with him. So in this particular association, Gadadhar was constantly by the side of the Lord, and Narahari was fortunate enough to enter into that association with Gadadhar. So as a result of that, he had access to the pastimes of Mahaprabhu in that Navadvip Leela very, very unlimitedly. Chaitanya Mangala gives the description that Gadadhar Pandit and Narahari Sarakara were extremely dear to Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And that Narahari Sarakara's personal service, if you remember, you've all heard it, some of you may not realize you've heard, this is given to us by Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Narahari Kiba Jaya. Now I forgot it. What is it?
Narahari Adi.
Narahari Adi Kori Chamaratulaya. That this was Narahari's service to fan the Lord with the chamara. Bhaktivinoda Thakur glorifies him in his Gora Arti song. And so this was the personal service that Narahari rendered unto the Lord, was fanning him in this way. So as a result of this, he was able to participate in many, many of the Lord's Navadvip pastimes. Bhakti Ratnakar, here again Narahari Chakravarti, describes the following. He says, Sri Narahari Sarakara Thakur's glories are most uncommon. Why were they most uncommon? He gives the explanation here. Pura Madhumati Prana Shaki Brindabaneshtita Adhuna Narahar Akya Sarakara Prabhu Priya. And the translation of that is that personality who previously in Radhika's pastimes was her intimate girlfriend called Madhumati is today appeared in the pastimes of Lord Chaitanya as Narahari Sarakara. So we can understand that there's this very wonderful mood there. It's a sweet mood. Now, of course, Madhumati, the gopi named Madhumati, what would we think? Well, Madhu, of course, is honey. So this means that the personality will be very sweet, but what was the service of that personality? The service of that personality was to bring honey to the personality of Godhead, to Sri Sri Radha and Krishna. So there's a very nice story about how one day Lord Nityananda came to Navadvip. Excuse me. And he came into the company of Narahari, and he said to Narahari, he said, all right, we know who you are. So tell us, Madhu, where is the honey? Of course, we know that Lord Balaram has a great fondness for honey, and that he would drink a honey-like beverage called Varuni and become greatly satisfied by such drinking. So he approached Narahari Sarakara. He said, so, I know who you actually are, so where's your honey pot? So, in this mood, Narahari took a clay pot and he went to a nearby kund, a pond, if you will, and he collected some water. And by the mystic potency of his service in Radha Krishna Leela, being to bring honey, this water turned to honey. And he took that pot and gave it to Lord Nityananda. And Lord Nityananda and all of his cowherd boy associates, remember we've spoken about them many times, the dasa Gopals, the 12 cowherd boys that always were with Nityananda, they all sat and drank all of this honey and became very, very happy. Fully satisfied, it mentions that they became completely satisfied from drinking the honey water, if you will, from this pond. And from that day forward, this pond became known as Madhu Pushkarini. Pushkar means like a pond, a place like that. So Madhu Pushkarini. So this is a wonderful place. If you ever get the chance to go, you should go there and see how sweet the water is. So in this way, even with Lord Nityananda, the pastimes are very wonderful. One time Lord Chaitanya appeared in a dream to Narahari, and he instructed him to install 3 deities of Mahaprabhu. And those 3 deities were worshipped in Sri Khanda, in Katwa. Katwa is, of course, the place where Mahaprabhu's hair was cut, and in Gauranga Nagara. These are the 3 places those deities of Mahaprabhu were to be worshipped. Now, in due course of time, we mentioned the place of Katwa. This is Mahaprabhu took his sannyas lila and went to Puri. Fortunately, Narahari was able to take place in those Puri pastimes as well. Now, this is because under the direction of Shivananda Sain, we've mentioned Shivananda Sain very, very many times, under the direction of Shivananda Sain, Narahari would go with the other residents of Sri Khanda to Puri each year for the Ratha Yatra season. Now, in the Ratha Yatra season, they would not just go straight for Ratha Yatra and come back. Sometimes devotees from here in Alachua, for instance, they'll go to New York for the Ratha Yatra. Many, many devotees from everywhere go to New York for Ratha Yatra. But they go in for 1-2 days, do the Ratha Yatra, and they leave and go back. Now, because these devotees were traveling by foot, there was no planes and trains. They were traveling by foot. It would take some time to get there. And then when they got there, they would spend some time there. And they would associate with the Lord for some period of time and enjoy some activities there. And then they would go back. So in this way, 2-3 months, they would be gone for these pastimes. So every year they would plan, the residents of Sri Khanda and all the other Bengali devotees from Navadvip and other places, to go under the direction of Shivananda Sain to Jagannath Puri and to see both Lord Jagannath and Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu while in Jagannath Puri. Now, the descriptions are given from, here again, Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami's Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita of the presence, because sometimes there are different critics in the Vaishnava line that have argumentative mentalities. And sometimes the argument's put forward, oh, but was he really there? So these quotes are given from the Chaitanya Charitamrita, and we can see that his name is mentioned many times. From the Madhya Lila, chapter 10, it mentions Mukunda, Narahari, and Raghunandan from Sri Khanda all arrived at Advaitacharya's house to accompany him to Nilachala. And then it mentions further in the next chapter of the Madhya Lila, after Jagannath's Snanyatra, Jagannath would be unavailable for darshan. Mahaprabhu would then go to the Alanath temple during this time to search for some relief from his feelings of separation at not being able to see Lord Jagannath. When Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya asked Gopinath Acharya what devotees were there associating with the Lord at Alanath, he mentioned the names of Narahari, Mukunda Das, Raghunandan, Chiranjeev, and Sulochan. These are all the prominent devotees mentioned from Sri Khanda. And then further it mentions that, of course, after the Snan Yatra, when Lord Jagannath separated, then sometime later what happens is the Ratha Yatra. And this is in the 13th chapter of the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Madhya Lila. It mentions during the Ratha Yatra festival, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu formed 7 kirtan groups with the devotees from Bengal. One of these groups was composed uniquely of all the devotees from Sri Khanda. In this group, it's mentioned that Narahari and Raghunandana were the dancers, and that others sang. So you might remember from reading those descriptions that it mentions certain devotees led the kirtan, certain danced, certain played on kartals, certain played on mridangas, like that. And then finally in the 15th chapter, near the end of the devotees' time in Jagannath Puri, when they're beginning to return and the Lord's giving instructions, it mentions the Lord then gave all the devotees directions in their service, and he told Narahari to remain always in the association of the devotees of the Lord. So in this way we see that this activity is confirmation. These verses are confirmation that Narahari was there in Jagannath Puri periodically, because as we mentioned, the devotees went every year like this. So we also, when we speak about Narahari, we have to speak also about Lochan Das Thakur. Lochan Das Thakur, of course, he was the disciple of Narahari Sarakara. And in his book Chaitanya Mangala, here again, we see that Narahari Sarakara was an immediate associate, or an intermediate associate, right there with Mahaprabhu's pastimes in Navadvip, and then his disciple, Lochan Das Thakur. And Lochan Das Thakur wrote the Chaitanya Mangala, for which further down it was felt that Narahari Chakravarti had to add to, because Lochan Das Thakur's, Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami's, these books didn't describe all of the second wave of associates of Mahaprabhu. So it mentions that Lochan Das Thakur was the disciple of Narahari Sarakara Thakur, and that in his Chaitanya Mangala he gives the following description of his spiritual master. He describes, my Thakur, this is a way of describing my Lord, my spiritual master, is Sri Narahari Das Thakur. He is very influential amongst the Vaishnavas. He is continuously absorbed in Krishna Prema, and in fact, his body knows nothing other than Krishna. To his followers, he speaks about nothing other than love of Krishna. He is previously known in Vrindavan Leela as Madhumati, and was a storehouse of sweetness, and was very dear to Srimati Radharani. Now he is present in the Kali Yuga as with Sri Gaurasundar as Sri Narahari. He is the keeper of the storehouse of love of Radha and Krishna. So this is in the Sutra Kanda section of the Chaitanya Mangala. Now, as we mentioned, in his youth, Narahari was very, very expert in the arts of singing and poetry and musical instruments. So he wrote many, many wonderful songs glorifying the pastimes of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Nityananda Prabhu. And he composed one particular Sanskrit work which is famous for its bhajans, called Sri Bhajanamrita. And the Sri Bhajanamrita had many, many wonderful, wonderful songs about the pastimes of the Lord. He also wrote many songs that dealt with the pangs of separation from the Lord. This was another very common topic in his writings. A very interesting thing about Narahari Sarakara. Many of you will remember from the Chaitanya Charitamrita and other literatures that if anyone glorified Mahaprabhu, he would cover his ears and yell, Vishnu, Vishnu, Vishnu. Narahari Sarakara had the adhikar, is the word. Now, adhikar means the qualification, or the privilege, or the right. He had the right to do Gaur Kirtan in front of Gaur himself. He was the only one Mahaprabhu tolerated hearing Kirtan glorifying himself to come from. And mentions, like I say, anybody else who praised Mahaprabhu, he'd plug his ears and pull, oh, Vishnu, Vishnu, and he wouldn't want to hear that. You know, he'd run from the place. But Narahari enjoyed this special privilege of being able to sit in front of Mahaprabhu and sing in a very, very sweet and unique mood about the different descriptions of Mahaprabhu and his activities with his devotees and his feelings in the moods of devotional service like that. Very wonderful. So, now there's an interesting thing I mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation about Narahari Chakravarti and Narahari Sarakara, how they become confused. And the reason they become confused is very simple. The author of Bhakti Ratnakar is Narahari Chakravarti. And in Bhakti Ratnakar, Narahari Chakravarti has included almost every song written by Narahari Sarakara. Now, of course, if you're going to write songs, many, as we see from looking at the pastimes of our Vaishnavacharyas, we see that when they write these songs, they sign at the end, "Thus sings Narottam." Thus praise Rupa Goswami. So here we have these two songs that are finished. Narahari Chakravarti Thakur, when he writes his songs, he signs them, "Thus praise Narahari." And Narahari Sarakara, when he writes his songs, he sings, "Thus laments Narahari." So sometimes it's difficult to tell which song was written by Narahari Chakravarti, which song was written by Narahari Sarakara. And especially since they're both included in the same book, it makes it even more complicated. But what's very, very interesting is that both these Naraharis are seen as great devotees of the Lord. And both give very profound spiritual understanding from their writings. So even if it's a little confused which one is which, they are both great Vaishnava authors, and it behooves us and benefits us to understand what they're saying, regardless of which Narahari we find it to be. Now, there were many works written by Narahari Sarakara, but there were 5 prominent works, which I'm going to read here. The first one is called the Bhakti Chandrika Patal. And the Bhakti Chandrika Patal was a manual for Vaishnavas to follow. The second book was the Sri Krishna Bhajanamrita. And the Sri Krishna Bhajanamrita spoke about many things, but one very famous thing it's known for is the section that deals with Guru Tattva. What is the qualification of a guru? How does a guru behave? What are the disqualifications of a guru? All of these different things, topics that we think are unique to our ISKCON society, as we have gurus that leave the path of devotional service, and this is only because we're fallen Westerners. This was all going on in Mahaprabhu's time as well. Therefore, the need for this book, Krishna Bhajanamrita, by Narahari Sarakara, to describe all these different activities, qualifications, and, when needed, disqualifications of a guru. So it's called Guru Tattva, the science of the guru. The third book he wrote was the Sri Chaitanya Sahasranam. And easily you can figure that out, Sahasranam, the 1,000 names of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And then he wrote the Sri Sachinanda Astakam. These are 8 prayers in glorification of the son of Mother Sachi. Not just Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, but Sachinandana, the son of Mother Sachi. So prayers that glorify Mahaprabhu in his relationship with Mother Sachi. And then the final one that he's famous for is the Sri Radhastaka Sahasranam, which of course here again, the 1,000 names of Srimati Radharani. So very, very wonderful books written by him. Unfortunately, all but one of them are hard to find translations or copies of. Krishna Bhajanamrita, it can be easily looked up. So now, Narahari Chakravarti, he disappeared around 1540 A.D. Of course, some of his followers claim that he actually didn't disappear until 1578, which would make him about 100 years old. As many of these historical biographies go, there's differing points. The prominent leaning is towards the earlier date of 1540, which would have made him in his 70s or so. At his funeral ceremony, the officiating priest was Srinivasacharya. Now, as we mentioned previously in speaking about Srinivas, this was one of Srinivas's expertise, was samskaras, different types of pujas and different types of ceremonial worships and all. So naturally someone, and we didn't mention about Narahari, but Narahari was very intricately, this is gone into in great detail in the Bhakti Ratnakar, but he's very intricately involved in the lives of, in the encouragement of Srinivas and Narottam Das Thakur. So quite naturally that Srinivasacharya officiated over his funeral ceremony. It mentions that at the funeral ceremony, the son of Lord Nityananda, Veerbhadra Goswami, was there, and many, many other important Vaishnavas, and any Vaishnavas from Sri Khanda that were still alive from that time period were all present there. And of course after the funeral was finished and they were all going to leave, but they were encouraged, the residents of Sri Khanda encouraged them, brothers, do not go away. An ocean of prema will soon flood over all of Sri Khanda. On the 13th day of the waning moon after Narahari Thakur has disappeared, a great festival will be held in his honor, in which everyone will be inundated with love of God, and we beg you please stay. So such a wonderful invitation, so everyone stayed. So we want to finish this pastimes of Narahari Sarakara with this translation of this wonderful song glorifying Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Now keep in mind that he continued to reside in Bengal once Mahaprabhu left. So, if Gora came back to Nadia town, my mind would then be filled with joy. Then I would see him, the source of all joy, performing his kirtan pastimes. Hari, Hari, when will I gaze upon that moon-like face again? When will that day come when the dam holding the ocean of separation breaks within my heart? When will I see the golden form of the Lord wrapped in his Yagna Sutra, that means his golden cloth? Lifting up my arms in the air, I will shout, Hari, Hari, and dance amongst all of the devotees. Saying such things, many of Gaura's devotees close their eyes and merge into love for Sri Gaurahari. When will Narahari's desires be filled? When will he gaze again upon that form of the young Gaurahari? So here he's desiring very much to be able to once again see that Navadvip form. There was a similar prayer by Gopal Bhatta that was lamenting that he did not get the opportunity to see the Navadvip pastimes of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu because, of course, Mahaprabhu met him after he was a sannyasi. So these are some of the pastimes and activities of these two Naraharis, both of whom we can very easily grasp within our heart and give some praise and glorification to and try and understand the mood of their songs. So we'll finish there. I'll ask my able-bodied assistant if we have anything in the chat room, any conversations, any questions. And any of you out there that are in the chat room that have some questions you would like to ask, please, we encourage you to send them in, and we will do our best to try and address them, speak about them.
No questions so far. Maybe we can...
Who do we have in the chat room tonight?
We have Scott Prabhu.
Ah, Scott. Hare Krishna, Scott.
We have a couple newcomers that I haven't seen before. Earl and Bhakteen Carol.
Bhakteen Carol and Earl, if you wouldn't mind logging in where you're listening in from. We always like to know where our new ears are coming from. Who else is in our chat room tonight?
William is also here.
Uh-huh.
And Ashley from the house.
Ah, Ashley, yeah.
Ashley and Sundari.
For those of you that are in our chat room, Ashley and Abai have just had the good fortune of having a baby girl appear in their life. And so we're very happy for them as they start their life as Krishna-conscious parents. And William, I bet William, I'm going to say that's probably... who's that going to be? Vijayananda Prabhu. I think that's Vijayananda Prabhu. Yeah, he mentioned he'd be listening. And William is his birth name. Yeah. Anyone else in there? Any questions or anything?
No questions so
No
far.
questions? All right. Well, we've run a little bit late tonight due to a late start with our new equipment. And we do thank all of you for your kind donations because that's what enables us to improve our equipment. Some of you may see that on the home page at Krishna.com we now have Vrindavan Temple. And the Vrindavan Temple cams are there. We have just one right now. We're looking to get 3 cams set up and to eventually have audio. But we have just finished, and I'll give you all a little heads up on this. It's not public information yet, but I'll spill the beans. We have just finished making arrangements with the Radharaman Temple of Gopal Bhatta Goswami, the head priest there, Padmanabh Goswami, and his family, and the families at the Radharaman have very kindly agreed to let us set up a webcam in there.
Wow.
And so we will soon be adding the Radharaman Temple in Vrindavan to the list of temples that you can log in and see the activities on. And you'll be able to see the most beautiful form of Sri Radharaman. So this will be very nice. Hopefully one day we'll be able to have video cams in all the 7 major temples in Vrindavan. That would be very nice. But as I mentioned, all of these things are made possible by the kind donations of you, our listening audience, and we thank you very much for that. And with that, we will finish once again another evening in the lives of the Vaishnavacharyas.
Sorry, there might be a question.
Oh,
Scott
wait, we have a quick question here.
He said he has a question. He hasn't typed in the
All
question
right,
yet.
so who's that, Scott?
Scott.
Scott, okay. Scott's one of our regular listeners and chat room members, and he's going to throw a question our way, so we'll wait and see what he's got for us.
He asked if we can see me through the webcam. That was his question.
If we can see him.
No, if the webcam can be turned towards me.
Oh, we want to see, yeah, sure. Abai is our able-bodied assistant. Does that do it right there? Is that it?
Yeah, that's me.
Here, right there. Is that good?
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, there you go, Scott. Abai is our able-bodied webcam assistant. He's with me every Monday night, and now you have a face to put to that name. All right. Well, there we go. As I say, we thank you all very much for joining us, and with that, we'll finish another evening in the lives of the Vaishnavacharyas. Hare Krishna.